All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get things kicked off. My name is Brian Weaver. I'm the Vice President of Sales for NSA, and I've got with me today Tony Loro, who is the Director of Technology and Security Strategy at Akamai. Today's session is going to be on the scramble to enable your remote workforce for things that have changed during COVID. We're going to look at some of the dangers specifically that COVID has presented and some of the things that are happening in that arena. What I'd like to do is certainly thank our partners, both Akamai and Tech Data, for their participation in today's event. And I'd like to introduce Tony. So Tony Loro, as I mentioned, his title, he's worked with Akamai with the top global clients, providing cybersecurity guidance, architectural analysis, web application, and network security expertise. He has over 20 years of information security operations experience, and he's consulted in a variety of different verticals, including finance, automotive, medical, enterprise, as well as mobile apps. He's currently responsible for Akamai's North, Central, and South American clients, as well as training an internal group whose focus is on web application security and adversarial resiliency disciplines. His previous responsibilities have included consulting in the public sector, managing security operations for a mobile payment company, and overseeing security and compliance responsibilities for global financial software services organization. With that, welcome, Tony, and welcome all.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I really have to shorten that bio. There's going to be a lot of
No
high
worries.
expectations here. All right. Well, let's get started. One thing for sure is that 2020 has been record-setting in many different ways. We saw a DDoS attack that was the largest DDoS attack in a very new kind of way. And by that, I mean, typically we see DDoS attacks be very large in terms of terabits per second. The largest terabit per second attack we saw was 1.44 terabits per second, with about 300,000 or 300 million packets per second. But this attack was smaller in terabit size, but was larger in the millions of packets per second, 820 millions of packets per second. So what this really does is this is a DDoS attack against the devices that have to do analysis, right? So this is almost attacking the DDoS defense platforms, if you will. When you see, I remember a couple of years ago, we were surprised to see 20 million packets per second. Just a couple of years later, 820 million packets per second. This is a massive, massive, volume. Some other things we've seen, just in terms of the overall traffic on the Akamai platform, 2 years ago, we were running at about 82 terabits per second. So when you look at all the traffic that Akamai delivers, we're talking about, streaming media, game downloads, online gaming, some of the world's biggest banks and social media sites, etc. Streaming of sports and things like that. 82 terabits per second is massive. But just 2 years later, our new high watermark had jumped up to 172 terabits per second. I think this was a mixture between a cricket championship league, a patch Tuesday, and then a big, if your kids are playing those games where they're building walls and running around shooting each other, well, that game, happened to coincide with this high watermark day as well. So very interesting stuff. The other thing we saw, which was even more interesting, was the increase in malicious scripts that we were able to identify targeting Akamai customers. So 43% increase in malicious scripts. And then this is just in a 1 week period, 43% increase in malicious scripts and 1,000 plus new vulnerabilities being identified for clients that are on Akamai. Also, 64% above average number of phishing attacks for this time the year previous. So the attackers are definitely changing their tactics. So I talked about that super large DDoS attack. 1.4 terabits per second again is pretty massive, but only around 400 millions of packets per second. But what's interesting about that attack is that we saw the attackers targeting 5 different IP addresses. They were using 9 different attack vectors and multiple attack tools and botnets at the same time. Also, which is really surprising, the attack was up over 1 terabit per second for over an hour's time. So when you think of like DDoS attack, you think, oh, well, hey, everything went offline, but ooh, it's over. We're safe now. I mean, this was, attacking for over an hour. That is very new and novel because most attacks that we've seen in the past kind of come and go very quickly. But over time, we've seen them, ramping up not just their, their attack capability in terms of size, but also duration and complexity. One thing that also started on my birthday, actually, August 12th, I just doxed myself in front of all of you, is a DDoS extortion campaign. So this DDoS extortion is quite interesting. We saw a lot of this in 2015. There were groups called DD4BC and Armada Collective. And essentially what would happen is you would get an email that says, we are Armada Collective, and we're going to DDoS your website for 5 minutes to show you that we can. And then we're going to do it again with the full force of our capability unless you pay us a ransom. So they're usually asking 5 to 10 Bitcoin, right? And Bitcoin's back up, over close to $10,000 again. So that's a significant amount of money. So if you don't pay, the attackers claim that they'll come back and they'll DDoS your website and take you offline. This year, Armada Collective has been back at the helm, as well as a Russian group called Fancy Bear. But what's interesting in the attacks that we have seen, they're not messing around. They were able to get 200 plus gigabits per second at the opening part of the ransom request, and by that saying their test attack was already 200 gigabits per second. And if you look at the chart on the right, these are showing all the different verticals that are being attacked and have been attacked so far this year. I have a new chart that shows the rest of the year. But this was the brunt of the initial attack campaign, targeting primarily financial services, and obviously gaming. The size of the dot here means it was a larger attack, and it affected more people. So you'll see at the top there, the orange dot, against gaming. Gaming attacks happen all the time. But this was specifically targeting financial services. But again, the attackers like to share the wealth and attack anybody they can. Another thing that we saw that was kind of interesting is kind of this lead up to 2020 of credential abuse attacks. We saw just over 85 billion credential abuse attacks through this time frame of December 12th or December 2017 to November 2019 across all of our customer base. So this goes to show the attackers are not just trying to make money by taking accounts or websites offline. They're also trying to get access to the customers, the people who are interacting with your business. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So obviously a lot has changed. I wasn't totally sure if this picture on the left was from I Am Legend or something, but I've never seen Grand Central Station that empty. But we're all working from home, or a lot of us are. And generally speaking, most organizations are about 60, 70% of their staff is working remotely. Well, there's some conversation, and you guys have probably heard this ad nauseum already this year, but there's some conversation of saying, hey, like, we don't know how long this is going to last. It could go on for quite some time. In fact, Jennifer Chrissy, head of HR for Twitter, said they may never go back to working the same way they used to. Which brings up an interesting case because just recently we found out that in July of 2020, two high profile system administrators for Twitter had their accounts compromised using a phishing attack. Someone logged in as them, and then because there was no other controls in place, the attackers were able to gain access to some high profile Twitter accounts. So all of a sudden, Jeff Bezos sends out a tweet that says, "Hey, if you give me 1 Bitcoin, I'll give you two. I'm feeling generous today." And of course, everyone's like, "Oh man, Jeff Bezos, he's the man. He's going to give us free money." Of course, that never happened, but it kind of goes to show what some of the impact can be of this new work from home model. And again, those remote employees were working from home. They were phished. They got their username and password, the attackers did, and then they tricked the home employees by calling them saying they were from Twitter IT and that they had to do something on their account. So the Twitter employees actually clicked OK on the two-factor authentication, and then voila, the attackers are inside the network. So how do we secure this digital environment? This transition has been going on for quite some time, even prior to 2020, in the way of something that may sound very familiar, which is digital transformation, right? That's the buzzword for the past, 5, 10 years almost. And what that means is we understand that people and things are connecting from new places into our environment. They're bringing new devices. BYOD is kind of an old story now. Now it's like, okay, well, there's BYOD. There's, people are bringing more devices into the ecosystem more now than ever. But also, your applications are now living in SaaS environments, in cloud environments. You're working with different development teams and partners to enable new applications and using APIs more now than ever, because the whole world has switched to this kind of mobile economy, it seems, right? This is a big buzz, which is the movement to the mobile workforce. And that just doesn't mean mobile as in they're remote, but mobile phones and devices that require APIs to get a good user experience. So there's a lot more risk in this, in this new environment, right? And not just in terms of, an S3 bucket that doesn't have a password on it, but even greater risks down the line. So securing this, we ask ourselves, why is it such a challenge? The consumer is requiring us to evolve and adapt faster than ever. And your people and existing processes and tools also have to adapt over time to meet those needs. So we talked about the changing threat landscape in terms of what attackers are doing, right? DDoS attacks and credential stuffing are not just it. There's more malware now than ever. Bot attacks. Bots are being used both to launch distributed denial of service attacks, as well as bots that are compromised home routers and home, IP security cameras. If I'm an attacker and I'm launching a credential abuse campaign, and now because my request is coming from, the IP space of Tony Lauro in Dallas, Texas, now it's a lot more difficult as a defender to be able to defend against those attacks, right? Because it's now there's a lot less room for error. If I block a good requester as a blue team member, as a security operations professional, if I'm blocking the money flow, it's a resume writing opportunity for that person. Let's put it that way. So obviously the shifting attack surface, I already explained it a little bit. A lot of cloud computing going on. The perimeter is dissolving. The workforce is changing. Mergers and acquisitions are happening, faster now than ever, depending on the industry, of course. And then those big mega trends I talked about. Digital transformation is one. I was just talking to a friend that he was like, "Hey, do you realize that our kids, even my 20-year-old, he's actually 23, but again, I'm doxing myself. Even my 23-year-old, he never knew a world where the internet wasn't available to him. He's a digital native, right? And because those are the kind of people who are driving trends and requirements for new interactions, they expect more, right? So all of this cloud adoption and mobile adoption, and even the Internet of Things with the say hello to any smart device you've ever owned, um, those are driving these changes. And those are also driving the security requirements, um, which are also driving how attackers are adjusting their focus, right? So if I'm, hacking into a big corporation, but I find out that, hey, if I send an email that says something about COVID-19 and 70% of the world is working from home, maybe there's a chance that people will click on that without the defenses of the corporation, the IPS and the network sensing devices to protect them. Maybe I can get lucky, right? Um, so we've actually seen, cyber criminals taking these lots of times previously existing malware families and using COVID-19 as a means to exploit the users. And again, if I'm working from home, I'm generally less protected, and the corporate security staff has less visibility into if I'm compromised or not. So the attackers are taking advantage of that. There's a couple reports from IBM's X-Force and Akamai's internal security research team that we've seen an increase in spam of 4,300%, which is obviously no small increase. Increase in VPN usage, which is not surprising, of 53%. And that phishing attacks against financial services companies are up over 64% from the previous year. So this is definitely a place where the attackers are taking, existing phishing kits that maybe used to be, hey, did you see the Emmys or whatever, or hey, the Olympics are coming up, here, win free tickets. And they're basically changing that and recycling those same kits using COVID-19 as a lure. So what is the problem with securing our infrastructure the way we used to? Well, the corporate network used to exist like this, where you had all of your apps in your own data centers, users connected to the data center from inside the network, or you had probably a generally smaller group of people connecting remotely, right? Because not everyone's taking their desktops out the door. But more and more often, everybody has a laptop. We're moving to the cloud. We're moving to SaaS and infrastructure as a service offerings because our users are more remote now than ever. They're at home. They're at cafes. Everybody's got laptops. A lot of people have corporate-owned devices, etc. And the general security consensus is, if I'm going to connect to these existing technologies, I'm going to use VPN, right? We've seen a lot of problems with VPN, not just in terms of at the end of 2019, there was a list from the cybersecurity group within the NSA that said there was 6 major vulnerabilities in most of the major VPN vendor hardware and software. So there's a lot of complex and risk involved with these traditional VPN solutions, and there's a performance lag. So the traditional trust model says everything on the outside is untrusted, and then you have kind of a DMZ zone, and then everything on the inside is trusted. Well, the attackers will phish credentials, they'll get access to this VPN, or they'll compromise this external user's device. And now when they come into the network, they have access to everything. Well, we think that there should be no model for trust difference between the inside of the network and the outside of the network. Instead of a VPN connection, which is basically just providing privacy, it's not providing anonymity, right? It's just tunneling the connection so that no one can see what's going on. You're still exposing the VPN connector to the outside world because the host name is vpn.companyname.com. If I'm an attacker, maybe I'll attack that endpoint and take it offline. What happens to your remote workforce, right? And we're looking at changing that model for a new model that says, listen, maybe all of our internal applications can be presented to users externally as though they were SaaS apps. And if we can create a connection that's tunneled through Akamai's proxy network, we can not only secure the connection, we don't have to open any firewall ports on the corporate network to let in traffic because everything originates from the inside going out. So you're kind of erasing the attack footprint of your corporate network and corporate perimeter, and then the user experience can be accelerated, across the internet to provide fast and easy connectivity for users. And we're not providing network access with this connection either. It's really virtualizing the application experience for the user, whether it's an SSH console, a VNC connection, or a traditional internal web application. We're virtualizing that and not connecting all the other stuff you probably don't need, which is all the other network baggage that typically is provided as part of a VPN connection. So as we look at how VPN connections work, it's important for us to understand the identity of the connection, right? So we look at that phishing attack against Twitter. If they were able to validate, now that someone made a two-factor auth request and then they're trying to connect, if they were able to validate the identity and the contextual signals of that user who is coming in and say, oh, that's weird. Tony normally comes in from Dallas, Texas. Is it weird that now he's coming in from Croatia? Maybe it is, right? And then kind of persistently looking at those device signals and seeing if anything has changed. And then obviously being able to look at traffic leaving those devices that are connecting into the corporate network and validating that they're not calling out to the internet for any kind of malicious malware download or anything like that. So this is a big piece of the puzzle, but that's just remote access. Let's talk about some of the other risks that are emerging here. I mentioned DDoS before, right? We all kind of assume that the internet is there for us to run our business. There's a lot of risk in that assumption, right? So we talk about the Akamai platform. I think now we're at over 300,000 servers. These are Akamai Edge nodes that are Akamai servers that are geographically distributed all over the world. And the goal of these Edge servers is to provide a proxy connection so that when someone hits your website, they're really hitting Akamai first, right? So this is what's kind of driving these record CDN traffic that I talked about, 72 terabits per second, and now we're up to 172 terabits per second. What's interesting about this though, because we are the first hop that a user makes when they come to your website or any major website, we're able to identify, over 1.3 billion unique devices a day. We're looking at web application and bot inspection rules being triggered against all of these different properties. So when we create a threat profile, we're able to create it based on what we're seeing across the internet in aggregate, and then allow you to apply your security controls to make sense of those things with that broader picture in mind. The other thing that we talk about a lot is capacity planning. When you think of DDoS attack in particular, you say, okay, I want to build my infrastructure. Now, most organizations don't want to build their infrastructure for DDoS defense because generally speaking, if we saw that some of the average attacks during the extortion campaign were 200 gigabits per second, you certainly don't want to build that out. But our Prolexic platform is specifically built for that, and we've been doing that for quite some time, since 2005. So at the end of 2016, we saw an attack that was close to a terabit per second, and we only had 3.5 terabits per second of mitigation capacity. So we said, listen, this is not 3 to 5 times the size of the largest attack now. Now we're starting to push up those numbers, and it's getting a little scary, right? Because this is all about absorbing an attack at the edge. So over the next year and a half, 2 years, we built out our scrubbing centers. Now we have 20 scrubbing centers all over the world, multiple scrubbing centers in each region, so that when an attack takes place, all of these scrubbing centers that you see here are telling the internet, I am you. I am your IP addresses. And using 8.5 terabits per second of capacity, we can absorb the front end of those attacks, clean that traffic, and then because the scrubbing centers are geographically close to where our customers are, that last mile connectivity back to you sometimes goes right into your data center via the backbone providers, and is extremely fast, and it doesn't impact your good user traffic. Everyone thinks, oh, you just put up a shield and block the bad traffic. Well, you still have to allow the good traffic, which requires that identification process to be even more precise. Another thing that we have seen over the past 3 years is that our smart mitigation capacity has increased quite a bit. So smart mitigation, or 0-second mitigation, as we call it sometimes, these are rules that we already have in place that we say, we already know what looks bad in terms of these attack tools. This type of reflection attack produces a UDP packet that has a header of this size and it looks like this. And as we've been building those over the years, we've seen that upwards of 70% of all the attacks that hit our customers are mitigated in 0 seconds. And that's based on that experience that we have, and basically being the tip of the spear for all of our customers for so many years. And that's pretty exciting. But there's other security considerations you have to think about when you're protecting yourself at the edge, right? Everyone's talking about the edge now. Akamai literally has been building out our edge network since 1998. But now I'm starting to see everywhere, hey, at the edge, at the edge. So this is kind of the, I guess, the Gen 5 cloud adoption, where everyone's saying we need to get closer to the user when we're applying mitigation. Even things like SASE are starting to say, yeah, you can't just do security, on the outside and then worry about network and performance on the inside. You have to marry security, network optimization, and user experience requirements together to make sure that you're creating the best possible experience for your business, right? But there's a lot of other things to think about as far as applications and APIs. APIs are being used to launch credential abuse attacks 4 times more likely than 4 out of 5 times. So more likely are you to be hit using APIs for credential stuffing attacks, because generally speaking, APIs are great for automation and people aren't inspecting API traffic the same way that they would with the web application firewall. People are even looking at identity management in the cloud as well now, as well as things like zero trust. So I talked about this remote access solution. That's based on a zero trust architecture. But as we go down the line, it's like, can you provide a web application firewall in between an external client and an internal web application through this secured remote access connection while you're still providing good user experience? And then malware prevention. As users are working remotely, is your security stack following those users wherever they work? If they're at home or they're traveling abroad, your security stack has to follow them and benefit them as well. So we talk about, during an attack, what does the business really care about? Ultimately, businesses, this whole stack here is business risk. The first question is, how quickly can you detect, right? And then once you start analyzing it, how quickly can you apply mitigation? Because you have to be able to identify, okay, these are the attacking IPs, I'm going to drop those off. Or in the case of an attack against SSL, these are invalid SSL requests, and these are valid ones that are going to our secure application. So the question now comes up, well, what applications and will my application still be available during this attack? The other question is, are good users going to be impacted? Obviously, if you say, hey, we stopped the attack 100%, but we also stopped every user, as I mentioned, that's a resume writing opportunity for someone who messed up there. And then what other collateral damage am I going to suffer from this, right? Any other systems that have gone offline or have to be rebooted, or that plainly stop working. A lot of in-cloud solutions are also prone to going offline, obviously, during a DDoS attack. They're not absolved of that either. And then everything after that, those questions are asked, is your remaining risk? So that's how we look at an attack. But most people say, well, the internet, scales globally. We've got so many fast connections on the internet. And I'm using a cloud provider. The cloud provider can take care of this. Well, we put together this little chart here that shows the challenge of scalability. And simply put, the last mile, which is from the ISP colo back to the users, has tremendous capacity, a ton of capacity. So we tried to do a little analysis here. We said, okay, in the US, there's roughly 400 million digital subscriber lines that if we were to be very conservative, we say they're running at 25 megabits per second. That's 10,000 terabits per second of last mile capacity before it hits the internet and the cloud providers. And then we said, okay, let's do an analysis of the top 100 major networks on the earth, or even in the US if you want to. And we'll say they have an average of 5 terabits per second of capacity to each of them. That's 500 terabits per second of capacity assigned to them. So if you look at the capability of force of a massive DDoS attack, or even users' expectations of pulling up a website and wanting to do stuff compared to what the capacity is of these cloud providers, there's not even enough capacity to go around if they were all to make a request at the same time. And during peak times, yeah, the internet does get slow. So having the Akamai network sitting at the edge, we are sitting within these POPs. We're in these colos. We have our edge servers there, and it's those devices that can manage the user experience and give them a good, fast response from your website. And if there's a problem with one of those edge servers, we simply route around it. Or if I'm an attacker and I'm attacking your website, I'm going to hit a mitigation device that's literally right down the street from where the attack takes place. And this is part of that process of saying, we don't want you to take a fire hose in the face. We want to be able to put defensive shields in place that are closer to the attackers than probably their own mothers. That was stupid. That was a dumb joke, but you get the picture. I figure attackers are real bad people, so they probably don't like their moms very much. I don't know. All right. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are third and fourth party scripts, right? And what's the big deal here? So when you look at a traditional, web experience, you say, okay, I know there's some bad guys on the internet, and then there's good guys. But we saw in terms of exploitation during the MageCart and Pipka attacks, which I'll explain in a moment, scripts that you load into your web page as part of your page load every single day, if the attackers compromise those scripts, they have the potential to effectively take your website and use it to attack your customers, right? So if I'm attacking your customers now, essentially what I'm finding is that, oh, sorry, one moment. So what we find is that if attackers are attacking, those third and fourth party scripts, they load those into your website, into your page load, and that now is going to be attacking the client side browser. So I'll go into a couple.
Hey Tony, your audio has changed.
This was a group of about 5 or 6.
Hey Tony, your audio is cut out. It's pretty soft now.
These basically, this was a group that were compromising these third and fourth party scripts, and they were using those to be loaded into bank websites because they were already loading them. And then as a banking user came to connect, they would basically, the JavaScript within that script would attack the client-side browser and watch all of their transactions. So as they're logging in to the bank account, they would intercept those transactions. So we know that external code, this is just like with anything. If you don't know what kind of external code that you're using, whether it be OpenSSL libraries, etc., when you run a vulnerability scan, you might find out that, hey, OpenSSL has a vulnerability. It's not even my code, but I just use this library. Well, all of these external scripts, you're not really scanning those, because when you run a vulnerability scan against your website, you're looking for known vulnerabilities in how the web page functions. But those external code script codes are changing all the time. We ran a request against Akamai's website itself. It turns out over 60% of our website is loading code from external sources. And then we ran another sampling request against our customers' web pages, and it said 80% of the pages that our customers have contain at least one third-party security vulnerability. So you put these two together, and it's like, yeah, if Akamai is using 60% external code, I wonder how other sites are. So MageCart works like this. I mentioned it before. The attacks are delivered by infiltrating the supply chain of the scripts loaded into your web page. So just think of SEO trackers, marketing trackers, user experience and performance monitoring trackers. And as the user interacts, that code is executing into the client-side browser. Now, what's interesting here is unless you can, talk to the client-side browser first, there's no way to detect that this is happening. So this is where we see the fake payment forms being created and card skimming taking place. And this is essentially just like, back in the day when you'd go to a restaurant and maybe the wrong part of town or even the good part of town, and all of a sudden 3 days later, someone in Brazil is buying mountain climbing equipment online. That actually happened to me. That's an example of how that happens, except now it's happening in a digital form. So the best way to understand the risk here is to look at all the different types of code you might be loading and understanding where that code's coming from, right? So first of all, is the code coming from, a trusted vendor? Can you validate what that code looks like? And again, when you look at the Akamai relationship here, we're loading a ton of code from everywhere. This is a star chart or a spider chart, and it's showing the relationship, those different lines going out to different bubbles. And then each of those different bubbles, the bigger they are, the more code that's being loaded from there. And then if you look in the top right, this pink graph here is kind of a zoomed out version of this. This is a ton of code being loaded from this provider up at the top, which is a marketing provider. So there's actually a website that we can send you guys where you can run this scan against your own site. It's non-intrusive, and it definitely should be something to look at. So the question is, what's next, right? So if attackers are able to load malicious code into your browser by compromising a third-party script, why can't attackers deliver a malicious payload like crypto locking ransomware, right? I had talked about this at the beginning of the year, and then I guess like 6 or 7 months ago, we started to see the same exact thing happening. Malicious JavaScript injected into a third-party content, you're loading the third-party content, and then when the user comes to your site, your website becomes like a watering hole for these attacks. So this is why it's important to have some kind of page integrity monitoring solution. It's the whole concept of saying, okay, if you're a traditional web developer, you might look at your website and say something like, okay, I'm going to run a waterfall scan to get a waterfall chart of my website. And what you'll see is things at the top are loading very quickly. And then little by little, there's all these long wait times for these different third and fourth party call outs that you're making. So what you might do from a web developer perspective is say, all right, I'm going to take those long load times. I'm going to move those callouts to the bottom of my page load so that the relative full page can show up very quickly for the user. Well, you'd be doing that same process, except you'd be looking, where are those callouts going to? And then once those callouts are loaded into your web page, how do you protect the user from being compromised? So in this particular case, we can inject good JavaScript code at the beginning of your page load that then watches the callouts going from the website, your website, to the client side. So what we're doing there is we're basically identifying, are there any malicious transactions or suspicious behavior that's occurring between your web service and the client-side browser? Because a lot of these client-side attacks, you would never know until clients complain that it's taking place. So this is something that we're trying to get people to understand more and more. And this is definitely an emerging threat. We're going to see a lot more of this in 2021. So how do all these architectures work together? So we talk about the fact that users are working remotely. You want them to have some kind of application-based access, not necessarily VPN, but in many cases, even at Akamai, we still have our VPN connectivity. There's just a lot of different things you want to look at that say, okay, I need VPN access for this, but maybe I can improve the user performance for these users who are connecting over great distances geographically by using this application-based remote access solution. Then as you stack on top of that, you want to say, well, what do I really know about the identity of the user who's connecting in, right? Is this the person who I thought was connecting, and do they look the same the way they did when they connected last time? And then obviously DDoS defense, this is kind of like keep the lights on. And web application firewall protection, you want to make sure you're monitoring all of the requests that come into your environment. Technically speaking, even if it's coming from a good user, you want to be able to monitor and validate that those requests are coming from not just a valid user, but that they're doing something valid. And then for the risks that you can't see, page integrity monitoring is essentially monitoring the JavaScript callouts that your website might be making to the client side. And then overall threat protection, this is a big picture of saying, what do I know, or what can I see with a shared lens across all of the internet that I can apply that threat intelligence data to how I make my decisions about my security controls within my environment. So this is kind of a screenshot moment. There's some real specific things here on the screen. When you look at threat protection in particular, one thing to mention is as the users are working remotely, they generally don't have the same amount of security following them as they did when they were in the network, on the network. So, but you can turn on like a client-based DNS inspection proxy that's watching for those recursive DNS callouts, and it's saying, hey, based on everything else I know about what's going on bad in the world, is the callout coming from Tony's laptop going out to the internet, is it good or is it bad? So not just being able to watch for threats, but if there's an acceptable use policy, as we're all working from home, we're generally using our work laptops more for personal use than we've ever seen before. And we've seen this as well as corporate IP addresses being the originator for more malicious malware. It's because of the VPN connected remote devices. So there's a lot to think about here, but this is kind of our high level recommendation on each of these areas. And it's a fascinating topic to go through. We could probably go through about 50 more slides and 5 hours more of content, but that's what I had for today. And I want to open it up to questions. All right, we have a question here. It says, do traditional defenses like WAF, IDS, firewall, etc., give visibility into client-side JavaScript attacks? Okay, yeah. So I touched on that briefly, but it's a great point here. A WAF and an IDS and a firewall do not give any visibility into these client-side JavaScript attacks, because as I mentioned, your web page is loading the content that it believes to be valid. That content is loaded up into the client-side browser, and unbeknownst to you, that client-side or that script that's on your site is making a malicious injection, if you will, into the browser of the client. So unless you can see that the client's browser is being exploited, which you would not be able to without any other kind of defenses, your other traditional security controls would not be able to help whatsoever.
Hey, one quick operation note, everybody has now been allowed to be unmuted, so you just unmute yourself and can speak directly.
Oh, excellent. This is my favorite part. This is kind of an ask me anything time. So if you guys have something that you've been dying to ask me, I've already doxed myself several times, so feel free to ask it. All right, there is another chat question that came in. How do you detect whether traffic to a website is human or a bot? Okay, so this is pretty complex. In the early days, we could do things like, okay, let's look at the header of the request that's coming in, right? Is the header coming from a known web browser? Is the user agent a good user agent? Does it meet this specific criteria? Over time, the attackers are like, hey, even though I'm using an automated script, I can certainly configure it to look and like a real user and meet all those requirements, right? So then they start to look more like a real user, and then they say, well, the blue team, the defenders, will say, well, I can detect that this is coming from a bot because they're hitting me way faster than a normal bot would. And we literally see these in the underground chats and configuration scripts for these tools. They say, hey, for this website, it has to be one request per 10 seconds or per 3 seconds or whatever. And be careful when you get to this page because, it's tuned even more stringently, right? So the attackers know how the application is being protected even. So as we started to differentiate, is this a bot or a human? We started to look at more things like we would inject JavaScript into the request and say, okay, as a request comes in, I'm going to inject JavaScript into the browser of the client and interrogate that browser's client or the client's browser. So for instance, if I inject it into a mobile application, I might say, oh, okay, it looks like someone's trying to log in via an iPhone, but the browser aspect ratio is not what we would normally see. Or it says they're on a mobile device, but we're querying the accelerometer for this device, and we don't see any movement on the phone. And there's no haptic feedback when they're typing, which means no one's really typing. This is all automatically generated. So we would do that inspection for quite some time. And then, then the attackers are like, well, hey, I can be a real user of the website. Why don't I just replay my own, device telemetry and try to log in like that? So then we have to start watching for that type of stuff, replay attacks. Then they did replay with noise, etc. Ultimately, what we've come down to is that you can only derive so much based on available knowledge of the client, right? So when the client makes a request, you can say, is this a bot or is this a human? But if you really want to be able to identify, is this the right human? You have to go back to the drawing board and understand more about the actual user from the identity perspective. So now we can say, okay, if I'm a bad guy and I'm trying to log in as Tony Lauro, I may have Tony Lauro's email address and password, but as I log in, I'm logging in from a bot that's sitting in DigitalOcean in New York City, for instance. But Tony, last time he logged in successfully, he came from Dallas, Texas on AT&T internet. This was the IP space that he had and everything, right? So if you can understand more about the identity of your users and use that to inform your security decisions, that's the real cream of the crop, so to speak.
Yeah. Hey, Tony, I know we have a couple more chat questions, but if we could just get to the promo real quick, I just want to make sure before we get to the top of the hour that we cover that for folks. Do you have
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
screen?
I'll take one more question here, and then I'll kick it back over to you. Does that sound good?
Sure.
All right, excellent. So for Zero Trust, the question came in here: do we need to install a client to allow secure remote access to applications? So that's a good question. The answer is no. This can be done clientless, but if you have a client installed, you can take advantage of more advanced features like device posture assessment and validation of the user in kind of a more granular way. So so you look at this from a third-party perspective. You may have third-party vendors that are connecting into your environment. Instead of giving them a traditional VPN connection, which also gives them, network access, maybe you can use this secure remote application access to provide access to them for just the applications they need to do their job without incurring any other additional risk of your network being compromised if something were to happen on their side. So I hope that answered all your questions. Thank you guys for being here. And Brian, I'll turn it back over to you.
That sounds great. There might be one more slide, Tony, that actually has the promo on it. I'm not sure if it's on the end of your deck or not. Not, I can just talk to it.
It is not here.
Okay, no worries. So one of the things that Akamai has been very generous about providing is they're going to offer up to any of the attendees on today's session the ability to assess up to 5 URLs of your website for looking for vulnerabilities and so forth. Now, that's about a $3,000 value for folks. Oh, here we go. Thank you. So, especially anyone that's out there doing any type of e-commerce, Tony mentioned as part of his talk slides today about, compromising even the payment section of sites and so forth. So I think it's a very important element for folks to make sure they have a handle as to what level of risk that they have. And all we simply ask is that you contact myself. My contact information's on here with my email. Just provide me with the 5 URLs or up to 5 that you'd like to report on. And what we'll do is complete the report and we will schedule a call with you to review it with you. So very generous offer by Akamai. I thank you guys for that on the Akamai side and encourage the folks that are on here to take advantage. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Tony, if there's any additional final questions that you want to cover. I know there's still a few more in that chat button, but I did want to thank you for a great presentation in the meantime.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see here. There was a question here about if we protect APIs. Yeah, so I mentioned before, inspection APIs is extremely critical. Most web application firewall tools right now, they have the capability, but it's very complex to find all the APIs you have. Of course, if you're a brand new company and you have documented, Swagger and WSDL files that you can import, it's very easy to find out what APIs you have. But if you've been around for a while, odds are your development teams have been creating APIs for an undocumented number of years. Let's just put it that way. So one of the things that we've done primarily to make that process easier is not only, is onboarding our WAF very easy and painless for the most part, but we can also do a discovery process to identify what APIs you have by watching your traffic flow. So doing that, we can now create a map and says, okay, these are the APIs that you have. Let's talk about how they're being used. And not only looking at APIs and inspecting them, but again, creating a positive, and negative model around those. Basically saying, hey, is this something I expect to see? And are the parameters of this actual API call, do they match up with what I'm going to allow in the application? If it's not, then you just drop it on the floor. So those types of technologies are definitely something we do, and we have teams that are proficient in helping you get there as well. So with that, I want to say thank you to everybody at Tech Data and NSA, and I'm happy to be here, and thanks for attending, everybody.
Great. Thank you, guys. We really appreciate your attendance, and please take advantage of that special offer. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.